for tools for building effective teams and partnerships. And just to give you a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about here today is, well, one I'm not going to be able to cover in this 30 minutes. What we are going to cover and tools for building effective team science. In particular, we're going to be focusing on one, which you might have gotten a hint of a little bit earlier, which is the team contract. And so what we aren't going to cover today is team selection, right? So how do you form an effective team? What factors do you use when selecting team members? How do you weigh each of these factors? There's a whole science on this, and we're assuming at this point you may already have your team assembled, or community partner outreach. So what factors are important in identifying a community partner, how to sell a project to a community partner, and what to identify, like what outputs are important to those community partners or stakeholders. But what we are going to cover is setting the stage. So I'm going to kind of put us into the same mindset of a particular type of team scenario where the team is just developing. Now, what I'm going to be talking about today can apply to just about any team that you form, but I feel like having that concrete example may help you scaffold the information a little bit better. And I'll be asking you actually, what are the challenges that you face when facilitating team development? So how do you get a team from just a bunch of people to an actual collaborative entity? I'll focus a lot of my discussion on the community communication infrastructure and the steps that you could take to facilitate building that infrastructure. And instead of covering a lot of the theory behind team development, I'll speak to the goals of what you want. What does a fully developed team look like, and how do you get there? And how do you get there? It was essentially, well, the team contract. And I'll also end with how it facilitates team development with some of the constructs that Sean talked about a little bit earlier. So let's get started. So getting us on the same page, say we already have this team formed. It's a team of, say, multidisciplinary experts who have identified the grant or the call that you want to apply to. And so what comes next? You haven't really, it doesn't necessarily mean that this team has worked together previously, but so it could be a completely familiar team, an unfamiliar team, it doesn't matter. And you really haven't started working together on the grant yet. So what seeds do you plant? How do you plant seeds to ensure that your team is successful both immediately and in the future? And so keeping this sort of scenario in mind, I want you to all pull out your cellular phones or use your computer and answer this question for me. So what are the challenges what are some of the challenges you face when your team begins to collaborate? You can go to menti.com and enter in that number 37404805. Again, that number, I can type it into, I think I can type it into the chat, 37404805, and just type in anything that you have, some of the challenges that you face. I'm going to share that with everyone here too. There we go. So as you see, a lot of different responses are coming up now. Hopefully you see a lot of different responses coming up now. Unclear roles, communication, building clear meeting agendas, different goals, power dynamics, complex structures, finding the time to meet, gatekeeping of information, people who don't follow through on commitments. Everyone has getting to know each other. You see communication coming up often, navigating meeting times, not knowing what to do, various roles, responsibilities, trying to get people to speak up. Wow, you guys clearly have worked in groups before. because these are all the problems people face when you first come together. This is, well, it's not excellent for your teams, but this is excellent for the presentation. So these are fantastic. And I'm going to go back to the presentation now and begin to talk, give you one big takeaway message here. A root of all of these problems, I believe, is that you haven't necessarily developed a good communication infrastructure within your team yet. And there's several ways to do that, which we'll talk about in a minute. So basically, if there's one thing I'd like you to take home from this section of the workshop, is that the core of all successful teamwork is communication. If you're unable to communicate with one another, you're not able to engage in good team processes, some of the C's that Sean mentioned before, you're not able to effectively engage, build positive emergent states. And in turn, that means you're not going to be able to perform well. To belabor the point just a little bit, think of it this way. If you imagine a piece of information that you need to share with one of your team members, it's a commuter, right? Someone has to go from work to home. If they're traveling on a unpaved road because you didn't spend enough time developing this communication infrastructure, that piece of information gets really, it takes a lot of time to get there. The ride isn't going to be smooth. By the time the information arrives, it's dirty, which means it's unclear. And so you're going to have to go back and forth a lot to develop clearer communication to refine what that piece of information needs. Similarly, you can, even if you build a nice infrastructure, like an interstate highway where information can go from one another, if it isn't properly maintained, so you don't revisit it, you don't kind of clean up the roadways, as this metaphor kind of suggests, information can get bogged down and held up. People need time to understand and clarify information with one another. The goal here is to build something akin to a Japanese bullet train, right? It's incredibly efficient. The information goes from one person to the other, and there's no delays or impedances in getting there. To put it succinctly, the communication structure that you build, that you develop, is going to dictate how well your team works together. And there's one particular tool that we'll be talking about in a little bit that really drives this point home. So if you're interested, there are tons of different team development models. There's Tuckman's model, which I believe Sean talks about a little bit with the forming, storming, norming, performing, and adjourning. There's Gerst's punctuated equilibrium model, which Sean discussed before. That's like halfway through the team's performance cycle, everything changes. And then there's Kozlowski's continual development model. And there's actually, someone mentioned a DISC model, and I thought that was kind of funny to include here, but unfortunately it was just a DISC model of personality, but it's interesting it was on there nonetheless. But instead of talking about these different theories of team development, I want to focus on the goals. All of these theories just talk about different ways in which teams can reach these goals. So when you think of a fully developed team, you think of these things, right? Everyone is on the same page. We have some sort of shared vision, right? We know the roles of one another. We know who knows what on the team. You've had a pretty well-developed communication infrastructure. So you know when and how often you're meeting and about what you're meeting about. And how you're communicating. That's incredibly important, especially with these virtual teams, is all the information through email, Slack, Teams, some other sort of communication platform. And you engage in activities that you ensure that the team members gel with one another. So how are you going to resolve conflict when it comes up? And how are we going to decide authorship order? And the way that teams get here is through developing a team contract. Now, a team contract, you'll hear several terms for it, but essentially it's a collaborative agreement made between team members that breaks down barriers that facilitates team success. And importantly, I'm not going to make this point again, so I want you to pay attention here. It's a living document that could be changed throughout the team's life cycle, so it could be updated as you go along. And if you're looking to build a team contract, there are certain components. There are various components that you can have, which are going to be specific to the team. I'm going to discuss some of the more important ones here. Well, I believe are some of the more important ones. But I'll ask at the end if anyone has any other suggestions, so you can share that with your group. Remember, we're team scientists and not necessarily involved in D&I research, so there may be something that we're missing here that would be very important for the types of teams that you work in. So remember, this is a document that you're going to keep. So this document literally asks these questions. You get your team together and you ask them and you come to a consensus on these things. So for example, what are the goals of the team? Was the overall vision for the collaboration? So this really higher order goal to get everyone in the same sort of mental state of what you're trying to accomplish. What are the scientific issues, goals, and anticipated outcomes of the products of collaboration? This allows you to create more tangible things that you can accomplish. It also allows you to better understand who knows what on the team and the perspective that they're viewing the problem space through. And what are the goals to be accomplished on various time scales. This not only gives you information about specific goals that need to be met, but somebody's work style. So, in some areas, you may be publishing 15 journal articles a year, and others, one is sufficient. So it gives you an idea of the work styles of, especially when you're working on a multidisciplinary team, so people can kind of get a better understanding of how you and your teammates are viewing the problem space that you're trying to accomplish. Many of you mentioned team roles as something that doesn't allow you to, one of the challenges of when you first get together as a team, you write them down. So what are the expected contributions of each team member and who's responsible for what? Answering those in a concrete manner is especially important to understanding who's going to do what and who has the particular expertise, in which area. This right here, this next box is really developing that communication infrastructure, right? So what's the technological platform that we will be using for communication and project management? Importantly, when you pick a communication infrastructure, or communication tool, whatever that is, it's important to develop norms around how folks use these technological tools. Otherwise, they're not going to be used very well. So, norms about how often will each team or sub-team meet, norms around what will be discussed at each of these meetings, and when we should expect everyone to be available. Again, this I think is very important for virtual teams, as many of us work in different time zones, and collaboration's a lot more difficult when everyone is not, say, working during the same hours. Maybe you have this sort of shared duration across the week where 4 hours where everyone's on board, everyone's online, and you should have some sort of expectation in terms of when you should be expecting responses. This even, a team contract can even address issues regarding data management. I know it's especially important when dealing with sensitive information that you store your data in a very secure way, and different universities have different security standards that are more or less, in terms of what indicates compliance. And so being able to discuss this upfront is incredibly important. And who will be responsible for the security and management of these data? That is something that is very often overlooked. And so you end up with data everywhere. You really need someone in charge of data management for the entire group, or at least knowing where it goes. Important Importantly, you can also have a component of conflict resolution within these team contracts. So how will task conflict, which is disagreements about task components, not necessarily interpersonal relationships, how will how will those things be resolved? Is it through consensus, majority voting, whoever has the most buy-in or responsibility? Do those votes matter more? Does their say matter more? Having that written out and articulated can be very important in making sure that task conflict doesn't detriment your team's success. Also, how will interpersonal conflict be handled? Critical incident technique or debates not so much, but more of the critical incident technique where you have the people who are involved in the interpersonal conflict with one another. You have them paint a context. What was the triggering event? What actions were taken that caused the conflict, and how's that conflict eventually resolved? Importantly, whenever you have conflict, it's not necessarily necessary for you to mitigate that conflict going forward, but it's always necessary for you to learn from that conflict experience, whether it's from a task standpoint, where you learn something new, or if it's an interpersonal standpoint where you learn a little bit better about how to work with someone who might not necessarily have the best temperament. And you have to work with them because you can't change the team composition. And lastly, your team contract can specify more logistical things like personnel decisions. How, when, and by whom will personnel decisions be made, and how will these decisions change over the course of the project? Importantly, this is where it gets a little bit fuzzy, and it depends on the type of team that you're working on, but deliverable and academic norms. So how will authorship be determined on academic outputs? So you want to clarify the process of what dictates authorship on a particular paper. Who will handle the various dissemination efforts? This is not just publications, it's also media inquiries. Do you want your grad student handling those media inquiries just because they're more active on Twitter than you? You probably should address those things. And how will teams handle intellectual property or patent applications that comes from collaborative efforts? Now, it's just a lot. And I bet you one of the questions that you're asking is like, why? Seriously, why do I need all of this, all of these seeds to plant before the team has even submitted a grant or formalized a collaborative effort? Can't we just figure out this stuff out as we move along? And sure, you can. But you're going to have to make split-second decisions that may not be copacetic with all of your team members, which can have some deleterious consequences on your future team processes and your emergent states. For example, a publication that your graduate student has been working on goes out but doesn't include other PIs on it that assisted in the data collection effort, which is actually a norm in your field but not in theirs. Instead of this being clear from the get-go, it can spew some sort of, task conflict can emerge from this, a relationship conflict even seeds the sows of, you can get some distrust from it as well. A PI, another example is a PI sends you an email at 4 p.m. their time, expecting an immediate reply, but you're in a different time zone, you have very clear work-family boundaries, and you don't get back to them in the next morning. Again, this may inhibit their ability to trust in your competence in accomplishing goals, which may not necessarily be true. You just have clear work-home boundaries, which I think are good to have, generally speaking. Or as you're submitting a grant, you need access to a budget from another PI before a grant is submitted, and you can't find it because they use a different data storage service. I don't know how many times we've been in these sorts of scenarios, but it can be quite cumbersome and difficult to do. And so it's really important to set some of these things up from the very, very get-go. And I'm not saying this only because they're good goals to have, but they facilitate different components of team effectiveness that Sean has mentioned earlier. So part of the cognition component that Sean mentioned is shared mental models. So when you develop shared goals with your team members, you also develop these shared mental models. Specifying roles and clarifying roles allows you to facilitate a transactive memory system. So who knows what on the team. Building that communication infrastructure not only facilitates good communication, but also coordination between team members. Remember how I said that maybe there's 4 hours during the day that all of you can be online at the same time, so it can facilitate those behavioral coordination processes. Conflict management can help facilitate trust in one another, help understand someone's perspective. It can facilitate learning. So why did you have this task conflict? What can we learn from this experience? Conflict is essentially meaningless if it doesn't end in some sort of learning. And lastly, having some norms around deliverables, or whatever is the case in your academic discipline, can help facilitate psychological safety. Now, I said I was going to ask you a question again, and I am. So now I think, let's see if I can just move on to the next slide here on the other thing. What are some other factors that you could see in a team contract? Are there things that I didn't mention that you think may be useful for other folks to know? And I'm going to new share and bring that over. The Menti thing is still, I think, the same code. And let me move it over to here. So what are some of the other sort of categories of things that you may want to say within a team contract that I may not have mentioned? I'll wait for some responses to come in. I'll be sure to see if it's working, because we got a lot on the first one and not so much on this next one. There we go. Well, there it is. Onboarding new members. That's a really great one. So what strategies that you should take to facilitate newcomer integration, feedback from team members, well-being check-ins. That's an extremely important one. And so you have wellness culture, all of these things. Transparency, that could be in terms of how things are done, your data agreements, coming up with making sure that you address shared goals. This is really great. I probably shouldn't have chosen word cloud for this, since there are so many different options here. How team effectiveness is going to be evaluated. That's a really great one. A lot of these, transparency, toxicity, how do you deal with toxicity on the teams? As part of conflict management, that's great. Authorship agreement. All of you are providing some really great toxic leadership. That's another one. Unspoken norms. That's, I think, very important, especially when working with multi-disciplinary teams. These are all great. Work-life management is something that I will emphasize over and over again. And so these are all great, and you can mention all of these in some sort of category or question, as long as they're discussed before the team really gets together and working on their project. So I'm going to move on and say this last part. There's only 2 slides left here, and I think I'm doing okay on time. You need a contract for every type of team. An investigator team, community team, private sector, like all of these teams likely need different team contracts. As you know, there will be different meeting schedules, different norms. Unspoken norms within your research team may not be a big deal, but it may be a big deal, say on a stakeholder team or the community team. Sorry, that's Georgia Tech's nice little one that hopefully I was hoping to get there without Joel, if you're in. Sorry for your ears. So every team sort of needs this team contract because you're not just one team working together on a grant. You have your investigator team. Each of these team members are running, or each of these PIs are running their own labs. You have different sites that should read 1, 2, 3, different site teams. And even if you're working with private sector, they probably need some sort of team contract as well, whether it's a research and development team or their legal team. And this last side, and I think most of these are within the resources that are in your packet, but the Georgia CTSA has a great toolkit, a team science toolkit. I'm part of their efforts, and it aggregates various team resources to help to help your team. There's links in the Georgia CTSA toolkit to example team contracts. If you're going to take anything away, the NCI's collaborative and team science field guide is absolutely brilliant. And then another example of a more welcome letter. So that's more of like something you would use for your research team. There's a citation there. And I know these sites are going to be provided to you. But on that note, let's transition out and see if anyone has any questions.